The MSP who is moving into vCIO, vCISO still handles the IT. They still handle kind of the technical blocking and tackling, and they're dealing with those fundamental issues as they have always done. But they are increasingly, as they stay within the operational technical layer, they are now being dragged into the boardroom, into the C-suite, where they are dealing with things that they never used to deal with before, right? They're dealing with technology budgeting. They're dealing with cybersecurity risk. They're dealing with compliance. They're dealing with business continuity. They're dealing with vendor management, supply chain management, long-term planning, and on and on and on, right? But what is really happening is that the MSP is saying, I'm doing this technical stuff, but what you really want, what's really valuable to you at the customer layer is the C-suite. Welcome to the MSP Zone. I'm Charles Weaver, your host, and here is the topic for today. Businesses often fire their managed service providers, hire a new managed service provider, and they still end up with the same problems 6, 12 months down the road, and nothing really has changed. The MSP is different, but the business problem, the conflict, the issue that is still there with the customer has not been resolved. And so what are we to make of that? What are you supposed to make of this? What are the MSPs listening to this supposed to make of this issue? Because it is an issue and it needs to be addressed. The point of this episode is not that customers should never fire their MSP. Sometimes they should. Sometimes. I think more often than not, I think there's probably a better solution than terminating the relationship. The point is that replacing the provider will not solve the problem if the customer has misdiagnosed what is missing. And that is what I want to talk about because I think it's an important topic. What kicked this all off for me, if you want to know, was I was reading an article written by a virtual vCIO. And I forgot the location of the article. I'll find it. If I find it, I'll put it in the show notes. But it's really not germane to this topic. The point is that as I was reading it, the vCIO was writing from a perspective of customers who fire their managed services and don't really address the problem of the customer. And of course, he had an angle, which is he's selling his virtual outsourced CIO, CISO types of services, and I have no problem with that. But that was his angle and what he was trying to convey. But sometimes the customer does not need help from another MSP. What they need is they need real CIO level or CISO level leadership layered on top of the what I'll call the kind of traditional way that MSPs have been viewed by their customers. And that brings up kind of this identity crisis, this MSP identity crisis that we've been living through for decades. We use the term MSP to describe companies that are operating in very different service model concepts or constructs. I'm going to describe what those are right now. Mostly waits for something to break and then responds, right? This kind of concept is decades old. We started to really summarize and categorize that type of business model maybe 20 years ago, roughly, to distinguish what was then emerging as the MSP model. A lot of people classified it as VAR. VAR is not reactive. VAR is a transactional, value-added reselling model that happened to evolve quickly into managed services or migrate into managed services. But VAR and reactive services are technically not the same thing, although at some point they started to merge, but they never started out that way. Back to the RSP, the reactive service provider, waiting for something to break, waiting to spring into action to make money when the customer is feeling pain, in this case, IT pain. That work, handling tickets, handling password resets, managing the user, connectivity problems, managing devices, user support, device support, patching, on and on. Those are legitimate IT issues. The defining characteristic of the RSP in this category is their reactive operating model. The important distinction here is the problem is not that MSPs handle technical issues, because MSPs do handle technical issues all the time. Every real MSP that I have ever looked at handles tickets. They handle password resets. They handle troubleshooting of the network, of devices, of users, of applications, patching, things of that nature. The distinction is that the MSP, again, not the RSP, the MSP in this scenario works inside a proactive management business model. A true MSP works ahead of the problem, not after the client has kind of already sensed that something is wrong, right? It does not mean that MSPs do not deal with impromptu, unplanned for situations. I am not saying that, because MSPs do that all the time. What I am saying is that the business models are fundamentally different. The way they approach the billing, the way they approach the pricing, the way they approach the contracts and how they are written are fundamentally different. Dealing with an RSP model, dealing with an MSP model. Okay? Fairly simple. I hope this makes sense. The true MSP, back to this categorization, they monitor the customer environment continuously. They maintain systems, attempting to make sure that if there is a problem that they anticipated, that they see it happening or about to happen, and they do something to stop the problem from manifesting itself in a negative way for the customer. It doesn't mean that they're going to be 100% all the time, because sometimes things happen. Hard drives fail, servers fail, right? Software and devices break down as a normal part of their existence. And so it's important to distinguish that the MSP is not an insurance backstop, right? That's something kind of very, very different. But the MSP does attempt in everything they do to use monitoring and other proactive maintenance concepts to be able to eliminate unplanned outages and unplanned problems from ever becoming reality. This is where the market gets confused, because you have so many of these RSPs who call themselves MSPs, and they call themselves MSPs because the MSP label, not the RSP label, is what is most dominant, right? Customers use the term MSP, vendors, analysts, conferences. When have you gone to an RSP event or summit or expo? You don't. You go to MSP events, right? So the whole world, our whole profession is wrapped up in this kind of moniker of MSP. And there's nothing wrong with that word. The word is functional. It works. We've spent a ton of time. We've invested a lot into that framework that supports the managed services business model. So I have no problem with that at all. Providers with different levels of maturity do, however, end up marketing themselves under that same term called MSP. And here's the problem. Just calling yourself an MSP does not automatically mean you are delivering proactive, accountable, strategic, managed services. Not complication, but to add some complexity perhaps and some texture to this whole topic. There is another layer of MSP operational performance that exists and is now quickly spreading throughout mature MSPs as they attempt to become more and more like what I'm about to describe. And that is they're moving into vCIO and vCISO types of services. We've been talking a lot about that on this channel. You probably have seen that yourself. The MSP who is moving into vCIO, vCISO still handles the IT. They still handle kind of the technical blocking and tackling, and they're dealing with those fundamental issues as they have always done. But they are increasingly, as they stay within the operational technical layer, they are now being dragged into the boardroom, into the C-suite, where they are dealing with things that they never used to deal with before, right? They're dealing with technology budgeting. They're dealing with cybersecurity risk. They're dealing with compliance. They're dealing with business continuity. They're dealing with vendor management, supply chain management, long-term planning, and on and on and on, right? These are things that the provider is operating at the help desk layer and into governance, risk, leadership, and strategy, and they're getting blended. But what is really happening is that the MSP is saying, I'm doing this technical stuff, but what you really want, what's really valuable to you at the customer layer is the C-suite, vCIO, vCISO types of services. That is the identity crisis. That is the issue. MSPs do technical work and fractional CIOs do strategy. That is an overly simplistic phrasing of this issue. The better distinction is that between reactive providers, RSPs, and proactive MSPs, and now a third layer of mature MSPs with real, vCIO, vCISO advisory capabilities, it's creating almost like a stratification in the market that is creating a lot of confusion for an uneducated customer who may not understand that there are many levels now. And I am not talking about MSP versus MSSP. This is not, and I repeat, this is not an MSP versus MSSP discussion. I quite frankly rue the day that ever came up. And I blame a lot of the vendors and a lot of the channel press for perpetuating this concept that the real and the only major distinction between managed services and the real mature MSPs are those who designate themselves as MSSP. It's false. It's demonstrably, provably false. That is not what distinguishes service providers. I hopefully have made a articulated, compelling argument that destroys that premise, right? That there are reactive providers, proactive providers, and then you have proactive MSPs who are doing a level above that I'll call advisory work. And the advisory work, you might say, well, Charles, we've been around, 20 years, 30 years as an MSP. We've always had that type of relationship with our customers. I do not discount that this concept has been around for a lot longer, and true MSPs working in that level who have been comfortable with more business focused kind of conversations and themes, they've been doing this for a long time, and this may not be new at all to them. Fine, I accept that. What I am saying, though, is that there is a noticeable trend where the MSPs who are saying, I don't want to just be known for how quickly I can close out a trouble ticket or how quickly we can resolve technical issues, although those are important things. The MSPs I'm talking to are the ones that are saying the value for us and the true demand for our work and where we are needed the most is not at the technical layer anymore. It's adding on top of the technical services, the advisory services, and those are the things that are mattering the most to customers. So this identity crisis is not simply MSPs doing technical work and fractional CIOs doing the strategy. It is this layering on of strategic advisory work amongst MSPs, and that happening and the customers knowing that they need help with strategy. And the only people they know to go to are the MSPs. And so this fractional CIO who wrote this article that kicked this whole kind of concept off, right? He kicked over this idea that it's true. The customers want more from their relationship with their MSP. And if they are dealing with either an RSP or they're dealing with an MSP who has not yet become comfortable delivering advisory services, then there's going to be some friction, some real friction with the customer saying, they're doing everything technically right. They're doing all the technical things that I want, and they may not know how to articulate this. They may not understand. They just may be frustrated because it's really difficult for them to make heads or tails of what their cyber insurance strategy ought to be. Maybe they have real problems with dealing with their supply chain vendors because they happen to be in the defense industrial base, and they're trying to make heads or tails of this whole thing that's called CMMC, right? There's so many other use cases here where a customer has legitimate questions. The only legitimate source of trusted advice that they can get, they think, is going to their MSP. And so therein lies the problem, that identity crisis and that friction that left unresolved could lead to a customer saying, you know what, I just feel like we need to terminate the relationship, and they go start looking for another MSP. But they never really put two and two together. And so they're just looking for another MSP, and they're going to repeat the same problem. So here's a good way to phrase this, right? So if you look at the accounting profession, right, as just doing taxes, right? I'm not sure actually where they started off. They probably started off as internal bookkeepers many years ago, probably centuries ago. And then they eventually went into tax, right? So modern day accountants, CPAs, have, for the most part, made their bread and butter on tax preparation, tax advisory work. Well, what happens when those CPAs started to get questions around mergers and acquisitions, around valuations, around global tax planning, not just local planning or state, federal, but going multinational? What about forecasting? What about investor relationships? What about, a whole host of other types of accounting types of advisory work? Not all CPAs do that. Not at all. And that's kind of a good analogy for the MSPs to follow, which is you're all in the same profession, but there are levels of sophistication. There are levels of value that you can provide to a customer. And let's face it, today's technology customer, even the small ones, are facing or will soon face a very sophisticated set of problems and issues that they will likely be unable to solve themselves. And they're going to turn to somebody. And better it be their MSP, because they're not going to turn to their RSP, right? That's the first takeaway from this, is that they should never turn to a reactive service provider and hope that they're going to get anything close to advisory services like they would get from a CIO or a CISO. They're just not going to get that. That's where I would like this to resolve itself, and the direction, I should say, where I would like this to go. And that is the MSP who is not currently offering vCIO, vCISO types of services has to make a distinction, has to make a decision very, very quickly. You have to decide that you are either going to remain at the technology level and probably face a very quick demise, or maybe if that's too strong a word, you're going to be rapidly commoditized. You will become a commodity in the true sense that, everyone will be able to do that work. They'll be able to do it with AI's help much faster and much cheaper. And your value will become less and less over time. And that will happen very, very quickly. That's already happening. I'll tell you that. That's happening right now. Option 2, as a true MSP doing mostly technical work, you will see the advantage of becoming more proficient, more expert in advisory types of roles, and you will begin quickly to learn as fast as you can, as much as you can about the unique aspects of your existing customers and where they are headed and the types of questions that they are dealing with. And you will try to step into that role quickly. And if you do that successfully, you will have, in my opinion, a very successful set of years, probably a decade or more in front of you, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that space. Option 3, you are an MSP and you decide not to seek internal expertise on advisory work, and you decide to simply refer that business out to an outsourced vCIO, vCISO firm or individual. I can't say if that's a good decision for you or not. I think only you can make that decision. I personally know a lot of MSPs who work with vCISOs and vCIOs, and it typically, but I will say this, almost every single one of the MSPs that engages a vCIO, vCISO, they do so with the goal of having the vCIO help the MSP to learn as much as they can so that they can do that type of work as well. And they almost always keep the vCIO along. I mean, it starts typically when they're helping them go through, like, let's say, Cyber Verify, when they're trying to get their certifications done. And then it goes into, well, how do we do this to teach that to our customers? How do we then add compliance downstream to our managed services customers, and on and on and on. And so I think that that's a question of, if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, go ask for help, or outsource and involve yourself with an outsourced vCIO and that type of a person. And maybe that's the best option for you. I think between options 2 and 3 are the best and most common for most MSPs, because at least you're engaged in the conversation with your customers. You maintain ownership of that relationship, and you don't just say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to be involved. I'm not going to answer your questions, your compliance questions, your advisory questions, because I don't feel comfortable doing it. I don't want to do it. Right. I mean, that is a reactive way of looking at it. And it's I think, a very dangerous posture to take. And so, wrapping all of this up into a hopefully concise way for all of you to understand, the managed services market is starting to separate, or at least to stratify. On one side, you have firms focused on IT operations and support, and on the other, you have providers who are rapidly adding vCIO advisory, cybersecurity leadership, kind of compliance management, governance, business strategy, and those types of services. And I think both models in the short term will win. Only one model in the long run will win. You can probably guess which one my money's bet on. But the mistake today is in pretending that these are interchangeable business models within the kind of overarching definition of MSP. And that's not true. I can tell you it is not true. Customers, more importantly, are starting to understand that that is not a true statement. So if you're a customer out there watching this, listening to this, and you're thinking about firing your managed service provider, maybe take a pause before making that change and maybe ask 2 questions. Did my MSP fail to deliver what they promised? Or are you now asking for something different than what you actually hired them for, right? Have your needs changed, and have you communicated those needs to that MSP of yours? That's number 1. Those are different kind of problems. And sometimes, the MSP is not used to that type of request. Maybe they're unsure about where you want this to go, and maybe just need to have a good conversation with your MSP. But that's where I would start, number 1. Sometimes replacing that MSP is the right thing to do. But in my opinion, more often than not, it's sometimes a very expensive decision to make, and it doesn't always fix the problem. Difficult topic, for sure. I hope this helped. But and if you're a customer out there and you're struggling with your MSP, again, I would urge you to talk to them, have this conversation. And if you're an MSP out there and you sense that some of your customers are beginning to evolve and maybe they're evolving at a faster pace than you feel comfortable, give us a call at MSP Alliance and we'll help you and kind of point you in the right direction, because it's a solvable solution. And I think that for the real proactive MSP, the answer must be engagement, not ignore the problem, don't evolve, don't do something and lose the trust of that MSP, because you've worked too hard for that to let it go without a fight and without being, there for your customer and trying to help them as they have needs which are changing. Thanks for listening. This is Charles Weaver, your host. Stay safe, get certified. We'll see you next time.